Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new episode of our Longsword Guide series. Today we are going to give a look to Posta di Bicorno. Posta di Bicorno is considered kind of a conundrum, as it is hard to understand what it is actually represented in the images of the various manuals. It is a position which is considered peculiar and hard to put into actual fighting, actual sparring. But in reality, it is not. By actually watching the images and reading what Fiore has to say about this posta, we can easily understand what it actually is meant to represent. Maestro Fiore says that Posta di Bicorno can do what Longa does, and he specifies this first posta before the other ones. And then he also says that it is able to do what Posta Frontale and Posta di Finestra do. Now let's imagine to triangulate this position by starting from these various poste. So if we start from Frontale, we have a slightly more forward pointed kind of position, but with the edge and especially the main hand pointing upward instead of forward. If we start from Posta Longa, which is actually the most important one beneath these three other poste in regards of Bicorno, we just have to rotate our main hand upward. So we have a reversed version of Posta Longa, which is useful to create up oppositions compared to the low oppositions of Posta Longa. And of course, at the end we have Posta di Finestra. Now we are on the right, so right Posta di Finestra. Posta di Bicorno is simply Posta di Finestra pushed forward. So we have an extended version, let's say, of Posta di Finestra. We can consider the relationship between Posta di Finestra and Bicorno as the relationship there is between Posta Breve and Posta Longa. But if I have to describe Posta di Bicorno in a simple way, I will say that Posta di Bicorno is simply the reversed version which covers the upper lines of Posta Longa. In German longsword, we would call it simply another version of Longsword, but in the Italian tradition it is different. It has a specific name. The complex part of interpreting Posta di Bicorno is usually related to the backhand position. So no one is able to understand if the hand is in this position, or this position actually. The reality is that the posta is represented in different ways in the various manuals. And the answer to me is simply that it's all of them. There is no motivation to consider one or the other backhand position different from the others in terms of use. Actually, you will find yourself more easily in one or the other position while landing certain actions. But generally speaking, they are more or less all useful. If I have to choose one, I will choose the hand pointed behind the pommel, which pushes the weapon forward, which is between the other two backhand positions. Now, while Posta di Bicorno is always in front of our body, if compared to Posta di Finestra, which is held to the side of our body, we have two versions of it. We can distinguish a couple of versions of it. One which is slightly backward and one which is extended forward. When we are extended forward, we are landing actions in Bicorno, basically. When instead we are closer to our body, and so we have a more tight version of the posta, we can start actions and parry other actions. So we can reach these two slightly different versions of the position to achieve different objectives. But in the end, it is always Posta di Bicorno. As Fiore says, Posta di Bicorno is useful to deliver a ton of different actions, which can be started from Posta Longa, Posta di Finestra and Posta Frontale, which are radically different poste, which achieve radically different objectives in the majority of the cases. So Posta di Bicorno does it in more or less a good way and is halfway between these three different poste, which means that it is halfway between reaching these three different objectives of the various poste already described. And this is another motivation why it is so hard to describe this posta. If compared to the whole system of movement defined by Fiore, which is relatively precise in defining cardinal points, we have here a more vague kind of quadrant described, which has the ability to deliver various actions which are completely different from one another. And this is because of the peculiar positioning, not peculiar movement or way of holding the sword, but the peculiar positioning of the posta. Now, Bicorno means two horns, but we actually have only one posta di Bicorno, so the one on the left. Does the word Bicorno means that there are two horns in a sense of two versions of the posta, one on the left and one on the right? Of course, the answer is yes, as you can imagine. Right posta di Bicorno can easily found in later manuals of the Italian tradition. So, for instance, in Vadi you can find the two poste di Bicorno, one in front of the other. One is Posta Breve di Spada Longhezza, which is our Bicorno, and the other is Posta Sagittaria, which is the opposite side version of the same position. And that is right Posta di Bicorno. In Marozzo instead we have Guardia di Faccia and to an extent Guardia di Entrare, which are the left version of our Bicorno, and on the other side we have Guardia di Croce, which is the right version of Bicorno. But why? Why Fiore decides to show only the left version of Posta di Bicorno and not the right one? Well, first of all, we have other posta which are generally speaking shown only or mainly on one side, such as Posta di Finestra. But we have, of course, a lot of hints that there is the other one on the other side, on the manual themselves. But for Posta di Bicorno is slightly different. Posta di Bicorno is easier to reach on the left with whatever sword, no matter what. On the other side is harder because to reach Posta di Bicorno on the right, you need a longer handle to room basically your hands and arms in a crossed position. And this is simply not comfortable with the majority of the swords which have a shorter handle. We know for sure that Fiore used, in the Fiore period, were used a variety of swords of different lengths and shapes. In fact, Fiore mentions it because while describing certain poste, he says that a certain posta is better with a longer sword and a certain posta is better with a shorter one. So for sure there were a lot of difference in shape between weapons. While instead in later manuals, such as in Vadi or in Marozzo, we know for sure that the sword was longer. And Vadi even mentions some measures, etc., for example, for the sword to be used in arm, etc. So we know that later in time the two-handed sword was longer, and also that the handle of the sword was longer. That's why in later versions of Italian fencing, let's call it, Posta di Bicorno on the right was common and useful, while for Fiore it was maybe an option, but not so important to be mentioned and represented on the manual themselves. Now, while talking about Bicorno as a posta, so a position to reach in space to deliver certain actions, we find for sure two attacks and a parry at the very least. The two attacks are, first of all, the upper versions of our thrusts. Of course, the main one is on the left as the main Bicorno that Fiore uses and shows. The other one is a two-edge kind of cut, which is an extended two-edge sottano from right to left, generally speaking, because the only version that we see described again of Bicorno is the left one. While instead talking about defensive actions, we have, of course, a parry. A parry which we can relate, as we will see in the last version of this series, with Frontale, but that this time we deliver in Bicorno, so with our true edge pointing upward as the Posta di Bicorno is held. The peculiarity of pairing in Posta di Bicorno is actually the fact that it is extremely easier to answer back with a thrust, if compared to pairing in our regular Posta Frontale. If the parry relates Posta di Bicorno with Posta Frontale, our malizie, so maybe feints, cavazioni, etc., are the one which relate Posta di Bicorno with Posta Longa. Now, while being in Posta di Bicorno, especially if we reach a slightly extended position and a slightly extended version of the posta, we can land our cavazione. We can do it in an aggressive manner or in a defensive manner, the one called the cavazione in tempo. So the opponent tries to beat our sword, which is held in Posta di Bicorno, and we land a cavazione to simply void the opponent beat and land a thrust on the other line. The actions which relate our Posta di Bicorno with Posta di Finestra are the scambiare and the romper di punta. So the scambiare can be easily landed from actually Posta di Finestra itself, Posta Frontale, or even, if we want, right Posta di Bicorno, which it's perfectly fitting also our description of the posta itself. Because it is able of scambiare, we can say that it is able of scambiare because we reach Posta di Bicorno while exchanging, or because we start the exchange from Posta di Bicorno itself. Now, by moving from this free posta which I mentioned on the right, it is easier to reach Posta di Bicorno on the left and landing a scambiare. This action can be landed against both vertical cuts coming from the right of the opponent, so our left, the mandritti fendenti of the opponent, or opponent thrusts without opposition or with lesser opposition than the one we are going to deliver with our action. The romper delivered from Posta di Bicorno is instead a consequence of whatever we are landing as an attack. Generally speaking, after landing, for instance, our mandrito sottano for the opponent hand, we can get back, and if we miss the cut, for instance, or generally speaking after it, we can parry whatever is coming from the invitation we are creating after landing the cut and reaching Bicorno, with a romper di punta kind of action, simply by moving back toward Porta di Ferro. So we can say that Posta di Bicorno is a very versatile posta. It is halfway between the three other poste which I mentioned, and it is able to do its job in a more or less good way. It occupies our upper quadrant in front of us, and it is useful to deliver our positions, especially on our left, because this is the stronger opposition in longsword fencing. Very good, people. Now I am going to read the glossa, and of course I will translate it for you. Questa è Posta di Bicorno, che sta così serrata. So this is Posta di Bicorno, of course, the two-horned, let's say, position, if we want to translate it, that stays so tight or so close. He is maybe talking about the fact that we can keep it very close, very tight with our hands in that position, which is actually very strong while opposing the opponent's sword and thrusting into the opponent. Che sempre sta con la punta per mezzo della strada. So this is actually a reference to the, in my opinion, action of exchange, or generally speaking, opposed to the opponent's sword. So, che sempre sta con la punta per mezzo della strada means that it always stays with the tip of the sword in the middle of the road. So on the center line, well, it is not correct to say on the center line because Fiore says that it is not a centered posta, but generally speaking, we can say on target. It is the best way of phrasing it, I will say. E quello che può fare posta longa può fare questa. So here we reach the most important part of the glossa. So, and what posta longa is able to do, posta di Bicorno will do too, basically. So here basically Fiore says what I just mentioned. Posta di Bicorno can do, actually, as you have seen, what the description of posta longa is. So malizie, etc. So feints, cavazioni, whatever. E similmente dirò di posta di finestra e di posta frontale. So, and in a similar way, I would say of posta di finestra and posta frontale, as we have seen for the exchange, the rompere, and actually crossing the opponent's sword. Pairing, basically. So, as you can see, in my interpretation, posta di Bicorno is far, far easier than what we generally think. So it is far, far easier to understand, to interpret than we actually think. And this is simply because we, generally speaking, are focused on the lesser important part of something if we find it peculiar or hard to figure out, while there are many other hints which may let us figure out what it actually is. In this case, it is the backhand. Everything rotates on the backhand position, while it is lesser important. It is almost of no importance if compared to all the other hints that we have in the manual about what posta di Bicorno is actually able to do. If we take these dozens, well, not maybe a dozen of hints on what posta di Bicorno is doing and how posta di Bicorno is held, we can figure out what posta di Bicorno is. Instead, if we focus on what we don't know, for sure, at the very least, so actually how the backhand is held, we can simply get stuck and we can't move forward easily. The best way, in my opinion, to solve this kind of little conundrum, as I mentioned, is to watch at what we already know and compare what we know to later manuals of the same or a similar tradition. Anyway, the same culture at the very least. And as you have seen by watching at Vadi and at Marozzo even, it is easier to figure out what posta di Bicorno actually is, and even to the fact that Bicorno is called Bicorno because there are two of them, of course. Very good, people. I hope you will find this video useful in some ways. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon, link in the description if you want to support me and the channel. And as always, see you next time.